There is a specific kind of silence that only exists in a city after midnight. It's the sound of cooling engines, distant sirens, and the heavy breathing of men who have seen too much and said too little. If you grew up in the 70s, you remember a specific shift in the air. Television stopped being a polished mirror and started looking like a cracked windshield. And right at the center of that glass was a show that didn't just depict the law, it bled for it. I'm talking about the raw, unapologetic world of the 1973 masterpiece, Police Story. But before we step back into those neon-lit precincts and shadow-filled alleys, I have to ask, where are you joining me from today? Pull up a chair, pour a glass of something strong, and let's talk about the shadows most people choose to ignore. Though most people think they know the history of the police procedural, they think it started with the stiff collars and the just the facts rhythm of the 50s. But they're wrong. The real revolution happened when a sergeant with a typewriter decided to tell the truth about the badge. He didn't want to show you heroes. He wanted to show you the cost of being one. Today we are peeling back the tape on 20 hidden facts that defined a legend. These aren't just trivia points. They are the DNA of a genre that changed how we look at the men in blue forever. You see, in 1973, the world was changing. The idealism of the 60s was a hangover, and the reality of the street was a cold shower. The network executives were terrified. They wanted another show where the good guy wins in 45 minutes and goes home to a smiling wife. But the creator of this series, a man who had actually walked the beat, refused. He insisted on something that had never been done, an anthology, no recurring lead, no safety net. Every week, a new face, a new precinct, and a new way to break a man's spirit. It was a gamble that nearly died in the boardroom before a single frame was shot. They said the American public wouldn't connect with a show that didn't have a singular hero. They were wrong. The hero wasn't a person. The hero was the struggle itself. The first thing you have to understand about the production of 1973's Most Honest Hour is that it wasn't filmed on the pristine backlots of Universal or MGM. Not really. To get that specific, suffocating atmosphere of the Blue Night, the crew moved into the actual grime of Los Angeles. Then they filmed in bars where the floor was sticky with secrets and in apartments that smelled of stale tobacco and regret. There's a hidden fact here that few remember. The background actors in many of the precinct scenes weren't actors at all. They were off-duty officers, often still wearing the weight of their shift on their faces. They weren't there for the paycheck. They were there to make sure the world saw the coffee stains and the cigarette burns exactly as they were. It wasn't about aesthetics. It was about an obsession with the truth that bordered on the fanatical. But that obsession came with a price. There was a secret tension on set that mirrored the tension on the streets. One, you had seasoned Hollywood directors trying to make good television, and you had technical advisors who were actual detectives breathing down their necks, telling them a door wouldn't be kicked that way, or a suspect wouldn't be talked to like that. It created a friction that you can see on the screen, a jagged, nervous energy that makes the episodes feel less like a play and more like a documentary that was never supposed to be aired. And then there was the casting. This is where the show truly became a sanctuary for the misunderstood. Because it was an anthology, every week was a chance for a different star to shed their pretty boy image and crawl through the dirt. We saw legends in the making, men who would go on to win Oscars and redefine cinema, taking roles that were essentially psychological autopsies. And they played officers who were one bad night away from a breakdown, detectives who were losing their families to the job, and rookies who realized too late that the academy hadn't taught them anything about the real world. One of the most haunting facts about these performances is how many of those actors later admitted that these roles were the most taxing of their careers. They weren't just playing a part. They were stepping into a reality that felt far too close to the bone. The network tried to censor the scripts. They were worried about the darkness. They wanted more shootouts and fewer scenes of a man sitting alone in a kitchen at 3 a.m., wondering if his life meant anything. But the creators fought back with a weapon the suits couldn't argue with: ratings. The American male audience, And particularly those who knew what it was like to work for a living flocked to the show. They recognized the silence. They recognized the exhaustion. It was the first time they saw themselves reflected in the glass, and they weren't about to let it go. There's a specific episode that almost never made it to air because of its depiction of a good cop making a choice that was technically illegal but morally necessary. In 1973, that was heresy. The sponsors were ready to pull out. The hidden history of that week is a tale of late-night phone calls and threats of resignation. The show stayed on the air because the lead actor threatened to walk and take the story to the press. It was a moment where the fiction of the show became as high stakes as the reality it was portraying. That was the power of this series. It didn't just entertain. It challenged the very foundation of what we thought justice looked like. As we move deeper into this list, you'll start to see that the show wasn't just a product of its time, it was a prophetic warning. It predicted the burnout, the corruption, and the isolation that would define the next 30 years of policing in America. But the most disturbing part isn't what they put in the scripts, it's what they had to leave out, because even the 1970s wasn't ready for the full truth. I want you to think about the faces of those men for a moment, the way their eyes looked when they thought the camera wasn't watching. There's a secret there, a fact about the way the show was edited to preserve a sense of hope that the writers didn't actually believe in. They were forced to soften the blows, to give us endings that felt like a resolution, even when the reality was a dead end. But if you look closely at the final frames of those early seasons, you can see the truth hiding in the corners of the frame. You can see the weariness that no amount of Hollywood makeup could hide. And that leads us to a detail that almost no one discusses today, a detail about the relationship between the show's creator and the real-life department he served in. It wasn't a friendship, it was a cold war. They saw him as a whistleblower. He saw himself as a witness. This tension birthed some of the most intense episodes in television history, but it also left him an outcast in the world he loved most. The cost of telling the story was the very life that gave him the story to begin with. But we're just getting started. The true weight of this legacy involves a series of accidents and coincidences on set that many believe were actually warnings from the streets. And as we transition into the next chapter of these hidden truths, you have to ask yourself, how much of what you see on the news today was actually written in a script back in 1973? Because the deeper we go, the more you realize that the world hasn't changed as much as we'd like to think. The uniforms are different. The cars are faster, but the shadows are exactly the same. And what comes next? Well, it's the kind of thing they usually save for the late-night shifts, when the only people listening are the ones who already know the answer. If the first few blocks of our journey felt heavy, it's because the truth usually is. We're moving into the facts that the network tried to bury in the fine print. You see, by the mid-70s, Police Story wasn't just a show. It was a phenomenon that was making the higher-ups in the real municipal departments very uncomfortable. There is a hidden fact about the 1974 season that almost no one discusses today. Several high-ranking officials actually tried to lobby the sponsors to pull their funding. They claimed the show was demoralizing the force. But the truth? It was exposing the bureaucracy. It was showing that the biggest enemy of a good man with a badge wasn't always the criminal in the alley. Sometimes it was the man in the air-conditioned office with a promotion on the line. This brings us to a detail that is often overlooked. To maintain that searing sense of reality, to sarol. And the showrunners employed a rotating door of consultants. But here's the secret. Many of these men were ghost consultants. They were active duty officers who couldn't have their names on the credits for fear of internal affairs investigations. They would meet the writers in dimly lit diners in the San Fernando Valley, sketching out crime scenes on napkins and sharing the kind of dialogue you can't invent in a writer's room. If you ever wondered why the slang in Police Story felt so jagged and specific, it's because it was stolen directly from the lips of men who were heading back out on patrol the moment the meeting ended. They were giving away the trade secrets of the Blue Brotherhood, and they were doing it because they wanted the civilian world to finally understand the pressure cooker they lived in. Now, let's talk about the physical toll. There's a fact about the stunts in this era that would never fly in the modern industry. In 1973, safety protocols were, let's call them, flexible. During the filming of one of the most famous foot chases in the series, the lead actor actually suffered a hairline fracture in his ankle during the first take. In a modern production, they would have shut down for weeks. But the director of that episode, a man who valued grit over comfort, told him to walk it off and use the limp. If you go back and watch that sequence, that grimace on the actor's face isn't acting. It's real pain. It's that forced reality that gives the show its edge. They weren't interested in perfection. They were interested in the breaking point. And speaking of breaking points, guess we have to address the cursed nature of certain episodes. There was a recurring theme in the writer's room known as the shadow. It was a rule that no ending could be purely happy. If a kidnapping was foiled, the victim had to be left with psychological scars. If a drug ring was busted, a clean officer had to be tainted by the process. This led to a very specific fact about the show's legacy. It was the first time a television series consciously chose to depict post-traumatic stress before the term was even widely used in the public lexicon. They showed the 1,000-yard stare. They showed the hands that shook while trying to light a cigarette after a shooting. It was a revelation for the American public, but for the veterans watching at home, it was a mirror. But the shaking hands weren't always part of the script. Here is something they didn't want you to know. Because the show demanded such high levels of emotional intensity, the atmosphere on set was often incredibly dark. To stay in character, many of the guest stars, men who were used to lighthearted sitcoms or westerns, found themselves spiraling. There are stories of actors who couldn't shake off the roles for months. One prominent guest star, who played a vice cop undercover, reportedly became so obsessed with the realism of his role that he started hanging out in actual gambling dens to research, nearly getting himself into deep trouble with the local authorities. The line between the police story and the real story was becoming dangerously thin. There's also the matter of the missing footage. Because the show dealt with sensitive topics like police corruption and internal politics, several scenes were cut by the Standards and Practices Board. But these weren't just cut for time. They were cut because they were too accurate. There was a legendary scene involving a payoff in a precinct locker room that was supposedly so close to a real-life scandal happening at the time that the network received a suggestive phone call from a very powerful city official. The footage was destroyed, not archived, not moved to a vault, destroyed. It makes you wonder how much of the show's fiction was actually a broadcast of things that were happening just a few blocks away from the studio. And then there's the technical side of the 1970s. You have to remember, this was before digital editing, before Steadicams were the norm. And to get those ride-along shots, the camera operators had to be bolted onto the hoods of moving cars or wedged into the back seats of cramped cruisers. It was visceral. It was dangerous. And it led to another hidden fact. The shaky cam style that we now associate with high-end modern dramas was actually born out of necessity on the set of Police Story. They couldn't afford the heavy rigs to stabilize the shot, so they embraced the chaos. They realized that a vibrating, unstable frame made the viewer feel like they were in the line of fire. It wasn't a stylistic choice at first. It was a budget constraint that ended up revolutionizing cinematography. As we move through these layers, you start to realize that Police Story was the father of every gritty show that followed. Without this 1973 blueprint, there is no Hill Street Blues. There is no NYPD Blue. There is certainly no The Wire. But those later shows had the benefit of a more cynical society. In 1973, being this honest was a revolutionary act. It was a betrayal of the father knows best era of television. But there is one fact that towers over the others, a detail about a specific unnamed officer who served as the inspiration for one of the show's most tragic characters. This man was a real-life legend who had a secret life that the show tried to hint at, but never fully dared to expose. a life that involved high-stakes justice that happened outside the courtroom. When we get to the climax of this list, I'm going to tell you why that man's story is the real reason the show eventually had to end. But before we get there, we have to talk about the Blue Knight himself. Not the character, but the archetype. Because in the middle of the third season, something happened during a night shoot in East LA that changed the way the crew looked at their jobs forever. It wasn't a scripted stunt. It was an intrusion from the real world that proved once and for all that the streets they were filming on didn't care about their action and cut cues. And what happened that night, well, it's the reason some of the producers still won't talk about that specific location to this day. It's the kind of secret that stays buried under the pavement of Los Angeles, waiting for someone to dig it up. And the next part of this story, it's where the hidden facts start to get a little too real for comfort. There's a specific kind of shadow that follows a man when he carries a shield for too long, and by 1975, this police story was shining a floodlight directly into it. This brings us to a hidden fact that many of the show's surviving crew still whisper about: the incident at 4th and Main. During a night shoot in a particularly rough patch of Los Angeles, the line between the script and the street vanished in a heartbeat. The actors were mid-scene, playing out a tense standoff with a fictional suspect, when an actual pursuit from the local precinct bled right into the middle of the set. The cameras kept rolling. For several terrifying seconds, the film crew was capturing a real-life struggle, with the actors standing frozen, realizing their prop guns were useless in the face of the cold steel being drawn just feet away. The footage from those few seconds was later confiscated by the authorities. They said it was for evidence, but the rumor on the lot was that the realism was so jarring, it made the scripted version look like a cartoon. That's the environment that this show breathed. It didn't just imitate life. It was constantly being invaded by it. And that leads us to fact number 13, the psychology of the suit. The producers noticed something disturbing about the guest stars who played the high-ranking brass. To capture the cold, bureaucratic nature of the captains and commissioners, they often cast actors who were known for playing villains in noir films. But there was a secret directive given to these actors: never blink during a confrontation. If you go back and watch the scenes where a detective is being chewed out by his superior, notice the unblinking, predatory stare of the man behind the desk. Yes, it wasn't just a stylistic choice. It was a psychological tactic used by real-life internal investigators to break a man's spirit. The show was teaching its audience how to spot the enemy within the department, long before the public was ready to admit that the good guys could be just as cold as the bad guys. Now, let's talk about the ghost episodes. There is a persistent legend among television historians about a series of scripts that were written but never produced because they were deemed too inflammatory for the American male. One of these scripts focused entirely on the breakdown of a marriage, not from the perspective of the officer, but from the wife who had to wash the blood out of his shirts every Friday night. It was a domestic horror story, devoid of sirens or gunfights. The network spiked it. They said the police story audience wanted action, not a Greek tragedy in a suburban living room. But the hidden fact is that the script was actually based on the creator's own journals. It was too personal, too raw, and it exposed the unseen casualty of the job, the families left in the wake of the badge. There's another detail about the sound design that almost no one picks up on. If you listen closely to the background of the precinct scenes, you'll hear a constant low-frequency hum. This wasn't a technical error or a buzzing light. It was a deliberate addition by the sound engineers to create a sense of ambient anxiety. They wanted the viewer to feel a physical discomfort, a subtle fight-or-flight response while watching the show. It's a technique used in modern horror films today, but in 1973, it was a revolutionary way to manipulate the viewer's pulse. They didn't want you to just watch the story. They wanted your nervous system to be part of the investigation. And speaking of investigations, let's look at fact number 15, the code of silence on set. Because the show was so deeply connected to real law enforcement, There was an unwritten rule that whatever happened behind the scenes stayed there. This included the accidental injuries, the late-night drinking sessions with the consultants, and the consultation fees that were often paid in cash to avoid the paper trail. There was a sense of us against the world among the crew that mirrored the very brotherhood they were portraying. It created a bond that made the show feel authentic. But it also created a wall that made it impossible for outsiders to truly understand the pressure of the production. But here is where the story takes a darker turn. As we approach the climax of these revelations, we have to talk about the real-life influence. There was a specific case in 1976 where a group of criminals reportedly used a tactic they saw in an episode of Police Story to bypass a security system. The backlash was swift. The show was accused of being a manual for the underworld. But the hidden truth is even more disturbing. The tactic shown in the episode was actually a dummy method, provided by a police consultant to misdirect criminals. The fact that it actually worked in the real world meant that the criminals were already one step ahead of the real police. And the show had accidentally stumbled onto a truth that the department was trying to keep secret. This brings us to the Blue Night controversy. When the show decided to do a multi-part special on the life of an aging beat cop, they didn't realize they were creating a blueprint for the anti-hero that would dominate the next 50 years of storytelling. They showed a man who was tired, cynical, and perhaps a little bit dirty around the edges. But the hidden fact is that the real officer who inspired that character was actually in the room during the filming. He was a man who had been forced into early retirement under a cloud of suspicion. He sat in the shadows of the soundstage, watching a younger, more handsome actor play out his failures for a national audience. Why, can you imagine the ghost of your own career watching you from the catering table? That was the level of haunting realism Police Story brought to the table. As we move into the final, most revealing facts, you have to realize that this show wasn't just a TV program. It was a confession. It was the sound of a generation of men finally exhaling after decades of holding their breath. But some confessions come with a price that can't be paid in ratings. And the final 5 facts we are about to uncover, they are the reason why, even today, some of the names involved in this production still won't speak to the press. Because the truth about the golden era isn't nearly as gold as they'd like you to believe. It's made of lead, asphalt, and the kind of secrets that only come out when the sun goes down. And what happened in the final season? Well, that's where the hidden part of these facts becomes a matter of life and death. You see, there was a detail in the series finale that wasn't just a wrap-up of a story. It was a message. A message to the people who were really running the city. And if you didn't know what to look for, you'd miss it entirely. But once you see it, you can never unsee the reality behind the badge. The sirens are fading, but the echo remains. We are entering the final precinct now, the place where the records are sealed and the witnesses get quiet. This is the home stretch. Part 4. 9,854 caracteres. We've reached the part of the list where the trivia stops and the weight of history begins to settle in. You see, by the time Police Story was entering its twilight years, it had become more than a show. It had become a mirror that the establishment didn't want to look into anymore. This leads us to fact number 16, the subliminal warning. In the later seasons, the writers began to hide real-life, unsolved case numbers in the background of scenes, written on chalkboards, on the covers of case files, or mentioned as filler dialogue. It was a silent plea for help from the consultants who knew those cases were being buried by the higher-ups. It was a way of using national television to keep the ghosts of victims alive, right under the noses of the censors. If you look at the files in the background of the 1976 season finale, those numbers correspond to real, cold disappearances in the Los Angeles area. It wasn't just set dressing. It was a desperate act of journalism disguised as entertainment. And then there is the curse of the badge. This is a hidden fact that many veterans of the production still discuss in hushed tones. Because the show insisted on such a high level of method realism, many of the actors began to experience what psychologists now call secondary trauma. There was one specific lead actor, a man known for his rugged, stoic roles, who reportedly couldn't stop carrying his prop revolver even after the cameras stopped rolling. He began patrolling his own neighborhood, unable to separate the fictional duty from his real life. The show had opened a door in his mind that wouldn't close. This wasn't an isolated incident. The production had to eventually hire on-set counselors, not for the stunts, but for the psychological toll of the scripts. They were playing with fire, and the sparks were starting to catch. Fact number 18 takes us into the heart of the Blue Brotherhood. Throughout the series, there was a recurring extra, a silent officer who appeared in the background of almost every precinct across different episodes. Fans at the time thought it was just a budget-saving measure, using the same actor. But the hidden truth is much more profound. That extra was actually a retired officer who had been shot in the line of fire and lost his ability to speak. The creator of the show kept him on the payroll for years as a silent tribute to the quiet heroes. He was the soul of the set, a living reminder that the stories they were telling had real, permanent consequences. He never said a word on camera, but his presence ensured that no one on that set ever forgot the gravity of the work. As we approach the end, we have to talk about the lost finale. There was an episode planned for the final season that was titled The End of the Line. It was designed to show the total systemic collapse of a precinct due to political corruption at the highest level of City Hall. It didn't just point fingers at bad apples. It pointed at the orchard. The script was finalized, the locations were scouted, and then it vanished. The production was told the budget had been reallocated, but those who were there know the truth. The script had been leaked to the real-life city council, and the pressure applied to the network was so immense that they were told the show would be canceled immediately if they shot a single frame of that story. That lost finale remains one of the greatest what-ifs in television history, a story too true to be told. And finally, at fact number 20, the one that ties it all together. After the show ended in 1977, the authenticity it pioneered didn't just influence other TV shows, it changed actual police training. For years after the show went off the air, certain episodes of Police Story were used in academies across the United States as what not to do or the reality of the stress training films. The show became a textbook. It moved from the living room to the classroom. The hidden legacy of 1973's Police Story is that it helped a generation of real officers understand their own humanity. It gave them permission to feel the weight of the badge, to acknowledge the darkness, and to realize that they weren't alone in the shadows. Looking back on it now, from the vantage point of a world that is louder, faster, and perhaps more cynical, Police Story feels like a transmission from a different planet. It was a time when men were expected to be made of stone, yet this show had the courage to show them crumbling. It didn't offer easy answers because the street doesn't offer easy answers. It offered us a seat in the car, a look at the paperwork, and a glimpse into the soul of the Blue Knight. But there's a final thought I want to leave you with. If you go back and watch these episodes today, don't just look at the action. Look at the eyes of the men in the background. Look at the way they hold their coffee. Look at the way they look at the clock. Because the real Police Story wasn't about the arrests. It was about the minutes in between, the long, silent stretch in where a man has to live with the choices he's made. If we ignore these stories, if we let them fade into the nostalgia bin of history, we lose a piece of the truth about ourselves. We lose the map that shows us how we got here. The world hasn't gotten any simpler since 1973, and the shadows haven't gotten any lighter. We just stopped looking at them with the same honesty. Don't let the silence win. If this journey through the grit of the 70s meant something to you, if you remember the weight of those stories, then stay with us. There are more legacies to uncover, more secrets to exhume, and more truths that the higher-ups would rather stay buried. Because as long as we are talking, the shadows can't hide a thing. Until next time, keep your eyes on the road and your back to the wall. The shift never really ends.